Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time with Izzet Phoenix and Pioneer. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and let me know what deck you would like to see next for our guide. So this is a deck that recently had a banning with expressive iteration being banned to specifically weaken the Izzet decks, mainly this and the Izzet control deck, and kind of looks like it also helped kill off the Izzet Prowess deck that was popping up, but that remains to be seen. But this has been the primary Izzet deck that you will see pop out throughout the formats, and that is a deck based around Arclight Phoenix, along with the various different delve cards, mainly Treasure Cruise. Arclight Phoenix is a card that rewards you for playing multiple spells in a turn, allows you to discard it, put it coming back to the graveyard basically for free. Another card that also plays quite nicely with that strategy is Thing in the Ice, card that saw play in the modern format whenever it was a thing before Faithless Looting was banned. And this deck seeks to execute a very similar game plan to what that deck in the modern format, albeit with a little bit weaker tools other than obviously the various powerful delve skills that Wizards seems hell-bent on keeping in the format. Beyond that, you just play a bunch of cheap spells. You play things like Opt, Consider, and Chart of Course, which has become the replacement for expressive iteration. Draw 2 cards and then discard. This did see some play in the variants before that, but there is very much a glut in these 2-drop slots. So it can be very hard to fit too many of these in, as this and Izzet Charm are typically the cards that see play in this slot. Ledger Shredder is a new threat that's been added to the deck in the Streets of New Capenna. Whenever a creature casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. So basically this plays nicely into your strategy as far as playing a bunch of spells. Also plays nicely when your opponent's trying to play a bunch of spells. Gives you another large threat that isn't necessarily dependent on the graveyard like your Delve spells and your Arclight Phoenixes. Then you have some red-based interaction for any type of creature deck you might run into, primarily Fiery Impulse and Strangle. And then you also run copies of Lightning Axe to be able to discard your Arclight Phoenixes in addition to your Chart of Courses and your Considers, putting them into the graveyard. Pieces of the puzzle helps fill up your graveyard while also getting spells to your hand. This is kind of one of the very few 2-for-1s left in the deck with the banning of expressive iteration. And finally, the centerpiece, the Treasure Cruises. These are banned in countless formats, whether it be Legacy, Modern, etc. Wizards seems very bent on keeping these in the Pioneer format, so to that end, this is perhaps the best deck at abusing the Treasure Cruise and Temple Trespass card that we'll talk about. And as far as land base, you do get to play some copies of Hall of the Storm Giants and some Ottawaros. Then beyond that, you're just playing all the red duels you can, and then red-blue duels you can, and then some copies of Islands, for any type of thing you might run into, like Field of Ruin, etc. Sideboard, you have to be very cognizant of how your opponent's going to attack you, and oftentimes that means attacking your graveyard, so your Delve spells and your Arclight Phoenixes are going to be significantly weaker in the post-war games, so you need some tertiary threats. This version is opting for Crackling Drake, which has the very unique ability of including cards that are in exile in its power and toughness, as far as your instants and sorcery cards, and also cantrips whenever it comes into play. Kind of nice for your grindy mid-range matchups and can be a closer against aggressive decks and such. Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, quite a nice planeswalker in decks that aren't pressuring your life total. So this allows you to draw a card, mill target player for 2. Kind of gives you an alternative win con over the long game. This is more for arbitrary value while cantripping, and its ultimate can definitely draw you a bunch of cards. And it can win you the game, as this deck does see a bunch of cards, and you can potentially, run out of cards in your library and win through it. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. Anger of the Gods for any type of creature-based matchups, especially mono red and humans. Decent against mono black, but some of their threats can outsize it, and obviously green, can sometimes outsize the red-based removal. Disdainful Stroke and Ether Gust for any type of Disdainful Stroke specifically for any type of ramp decks, and can be okay against the control decks, as oftentimes a lot of their finishers are 4 and 5 mana, but obviously this is very good against the mono green Devotion deck. Ether Gust, very good against mono green, while also being very good against mono red. It's a card you usually saw a ton against something like Winota, but obviously Winota is no longer in the format with the bannings. Unlicensed First and Soulgone Lantern, different effects of Graveyard Hate for whether it be the Greasefang combo deck or other Izzet Phoenix decks or other Izzet decks in general. Soulgone Lantern obviously comes down, exiles a card, and then you can sacrifice it to either draw a card or exile your opponent's library. And Licensed First just kind of sits in play, chips away at your opponent's graveyard as you get to target the card specifically, and then this can be an arbitrary large threat that can threaten to win the game out of nowhere. And then Spell Pierce will need a little bit of disruption for any type of combo or control deck that you might be facing off against. So this version's a little bit different. This pilot obviously is deciding not to run as many copies of Ledger Shredder. It's going for a little bit more of a combo build. It's centered around Galvanic Iteration and Temporal Trespass. This basically allows your Thing in the Ices and Arclight Phoenixes to kind of finish the game out of nowhere. Oftentimes you find yourself when you're playing against this deck, seeing a game where, say, you kill their first Thing in the Ice, maybe they have one Arclight Phoenix in the graveyard, it's come back, you've killed it once. You're thinking you're in this pretty good spot, they're going to be dead the next turn, then all of a sudden they play Galvanic Iteration, copy a Temporal Trespass, which is a delve spell that takes turns, and then say they discard a couple copies of Arclight Phoenix sometime during that turn. All of a sudden you're getting hit for 9 one turn, 9 the next turn, and then you're dead. Beyond that, you're still seeing a lot of the same things. A little bit less on the Ledger Shredders, but you're still seeing the same core. You're still seeing the pieces of the puzzles, Thing in the Ices, the Arclight Phoenixes, the red base interaction, the Considers and the Ops, 19 lands. You are seeing one Crucible of Defiance as another spell-based land, as this deck can see a lot of cards, especially in the mid-game. And then, beyond that, you're just trying to close out the game with the Temporal Trespass while still having the card advantage of a couple copies of Treasure Cruise. Sideboard plan's a little bit different for this deck. This version's running a little bit less on the sweepers, but a little bit more interaction, things like Mystical Dispute for any type of blue-based decks. Copies of a Braid as both interaction against any type of vehicles, whether it be either Grease Fang decks, any type of artifact-based decks you might face down, like the improvised decks that have been popping around a little bit, especially more in the Explorer format, but is something that could pop up occasionally in Pioneer. Tablet of the Guilds, this is mainly for aggressive-based decks, especially mono red, which can be a little bit of a rough matchup. Fry for any type of control-based decks or anything that's playing blue-based threats, such as other Things in the Ice and Planeswalkers out of the blue-based control decks. Alpine Moon, this is primarily here for Nykthos and for Lotus Field. Lotus Field can be a little bit of a difficult matchup, but we'll cover that in a little bit. Finally, a deck labeled Selesnya Aggro by MTG Goldfish for whatever reason. You're seeing a lot of the same cards. This version isn't quite as much in on the combo. You have one Iteration, one Temporal Trespass. They're just kind of incidental ways to clear out the game. One card you're seeing with this version is Strategic Planning over Charter Course. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them in your hand, rest in your graveyard. Great way to fill your graveyard while also getting the top 3. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. Very much like Pieces of the Puzzle, this kind of gives you fuel for what you're trying to do. The downside of Pieces of the Puzzle is you can't find either of your creatures, or if you happen to play Ledger Shredder, you can't find that, whereas Strategic Planning does let you see that. The downside is it doesn't let you discard like Charter Course does. But this card also plays Izzet Charm. Izzet Charm's very flexible, but it's very low powered. It can be a bad Spell Pierce, it can be a bad looting effect, and it can be a bad shock effect for creatures. So it's overcosted for each of the things it does, but obviously it gives you a lot of flexibility with what it does. And you can go like turn 2, end of turn, loot to pitch a couple Phoenixes, and then the following turn chain off 3 1-mana spells, potentially getting a couple Phoenixes on turn 3, really putting the pressure on your opponent. So it is a very powerful spell, the fact that it has instant speed and stuff, but is a little bit underpowered. It's decent for the Pioneer format, proved to be a little bit too weak for the modern format overall when this deck was more of a thing. Sideboard, this one runs a couple different threats. Niv-Mizzet Perun is quite a difficult threat for the control decks to deal with, especially if they happen to have boarded out some other sweepers. It's a little bit more mana for March of the Multitudes or stuff. Obviously things like Wandering Emperor can still be a pain in the butt for this card, but you're a little bit better set up to deal with Wandering Emperor, and you can just ping your opponent out. Crackling Drake we've already touched on. Chandra Torch of Defiance is another card much like Jacob's Wielder of Mysteries that you can play. It does a little bit different suite of things. It allows you to exile cards top of your library, gets you a little bit ahead on mana, deals with creatures. So it defends itself a little bit better, but it doesn't necessarily fit in your gameplay as much, but it still is a nice card. Narset, this one's a weird one that saw some play, especially in Modern in the early times, and it's very good in the mirror match, very good against the good against the control decks depending on how they're set up. Makes cantripping very much difficult, especially against some of your weaker matchups like Lotus Field and the mirror match. Anger of the Gods we've already talked about. Most of these other ones we've talked about. Negate, obviously, just being a hard counter for any type of non-creature spells. Now, as far as how to attack the deck, there's a couple different ways with Izzet Phoenix. Izzet Phoenix is a deck that is very predicated on setup, payoff. This is a deck that does a lot of wheel spinning, especially in Game 1 with your Arclight Phoenixes and your Things in the Ice. if you're on an Arclight draw, it requires one way to attack. If you're on a Thing in the Ice draw, it just requires a removal spell and kind of gets blown up. That said, Thing in the Ice isn't the easiest creature to remove. I mean, obviously Fatal Push does it, a lot of the black-based removal does it, but a lot of the normally played red-based removal, especially in game number 1, doesn't kill it on a one-for-one basis. And this is one of those cards that against the creature-based strategies can really kind of take over. Flip it, bounce your opponent's board back their thing, you get an attack for 7. Say if they're on mono green, you get to kill one of their planeswalkers. If they're on some type of mono red deck, you can flip their board at the end step, completely reset their thing, get in for 7 before they can really chip in for some damage. But this is a deck that does require setups. Decks that can get under it, like mono red, the Aura's decks when they happen to see play, can often get out of the range of the spells and can often gain a little bit of life. And they have just enough disruption to really kind of keep this deck at bay. Alternatively, you can go over the top with something like blue-white control, playing copies of Narset, exiling all their threats. One of the things is much like a deck like blue-red Murktide in the modern format, this deck doesn't play a ton of threats. Now, some of them are resilient, like Arclight Phoenix, but if you happen to play a ton of exile-based removal, you can just kind of run this deck out of threats. And that's why you see a lot of tertiary threats in the sideboard, additional planeswalkers or creatures like Crackling Drake or Niv-Mizzet. Previously you've seen copies of things like Stormwing Drake, Sprite Dragon in these decks. A lot of these were just to get around the fact that this deck is very weak. And finally, the other way you can attack the deck is you can attack the deck on the basis of the graveyard. Now, this deck, especially in game number 1, is very reliant on the graveyard with the Delve spells and the Arclight Phoenixes. Outside of that, their only real threat is Thing in the Ice, sometimes Ledger Shredder, depending on the build. Attacking them with the graveyard, things like Leyline Sanctity, Rest in Peace, Grafdigger's Cage. These are all things that they can struggle to deal with, especially the enchantments. One of the things blue and red struggles terribly with is enchantments, unless they're playing something like a Brazen Borrower or some type of bounce spell. If it happens to resolve, or if it's a Leyline and just goes into play on turn 0, they can often have problems with that part of their deck, hence why you see a lot of threats in their sideboard that aren't terribly based on that. And then another card that can help to attack is a card like Narset. This deck does play a lot of cantrips. Keeping them from cantripping, especially on a key turn, can be really important. Now, obviously, some of them play things like strategic planning, pieces of the puzzle that allow them to see cards without drawing cards, but cards like Treasure Cruise are basically completely useless with Narset in play. That said, you happen to play a Narset, you don't always want to take it down against this deck. Sometimes you just want to leave it on 5, force them to have two red-based removal spells, which, as you'll see, Fiery Impulse only deals damage to creature, Flame Blast Bolt does damage to both, Lightning Axe only deals with creatures. So if you leave a Narset in play on 5, they often have a hard time dealing with it if you're able to control their board. And then, once again, there are specific cards. Eidolon the Great Rebel. This is a deck that's trying to cast a lot of cheap spells, gives them a lot of damage if they can't find a red-based removal quickly. Cards like Archon of Emeria only being able to cast 1 turn. Cards like Deafening Silence. Basically anything that keeps them from casting a bunch of spells on a turn, attacks their graveyard, or exiles their threats are very good against the deck. And generally you want to either go way over the top with a control deck that can match their card advantage while also negating their threats, or a deck like Mono Red or another aggressive shell like Auras that can just completely ignore what they're doing, get under them, and kind of blow them apart, which are kind of the decks that primarily attack them. Then the alternative is to just completely ignore what they're doing. Decks like Mardu and Esper Greasefang, if they can't interact with your Greasefang on the key turn, you can just hit them for 13 and then hit them for 8 and the game's over. Whether you can attack them with something like Lotus Field combo, which just completely ignores what they're doing game 1, and it's just kind of a goldfish of who can execute their game plan more quickly. Can the Arclight Phoenix deck get enough pressure to kill the Lotus Field player, or does the Lotus Field player just combo off and not care? Hence why you saw things like Alpine Moon in some of these builds. And finally, a deck like Rakdos midrange, while it doesn't have the best matchup against Izzet Phoenix, does have some tools. If you can Thoughtseize their key cantrip and then hit them with a Graveyard Trespasser and then hit them with Unlicensed Hearse. There is a certain, once they hit a certain layer of removal and exile effects, this deck just can't function. And while that is not very practical, as this deck can often outgrind any mid-range deck in the format just because it sees so many cards, there are some strategies or some combination of cards that can beat this deck. So basically, everything can beat Arclight Phoenix, but you have to know your role. Are you the aggressor or are you the control deck? Very rarely can you go top deck for top deck with this deck, is this deck will often top deck better than most decks in the format in that regard. It's just because of all the delve spells, because of the Arclight Phoenix recursion, because of Thing in the Ice being such a threat if it flips, etc. This is a deck that has survived the expressive iteration ban quite well, and Wizards has said it is their goal to keep these delve spells in the format for whatever reason, even though it's now gotten 2 different cards, 2 different series of things banned, with Inverter and now expressive iteration both being banned, largely because of these delve spells. So that said, hope this gives you a better idea of Izzet Phoenix. Obviously, it's been a staple of the Pioneer format since the format's inception. And, did lose one of its powerful tools, but it's still a very powerful deck with the delve spells and Arclight Phoenix. And then whatever tertiary threats you want to play around, whether it be Thing in the Ice, Ledger Shredder, stuff in the sideboard, etc., can kind of turn into an Izzet control deck in some of the post-board matchups. So this deck can definitely play a lot of different strategies, and is very powerful overall, and something you need to be aware of in any Pioneer tournament. As a friendly reminder, if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and let me know down in the comments what deck you would like to see next in our deep deck dive.